October 21st, 1942. 23:55 hours. A Japanese barge exploded. Not burned. Not sank slowly. Exploded. The ammunition stored in its belly cooked off in a single violent instant, and the fireball was visible from 3 miles away across Iron Bottom Sound. Men who had been alive 1 second ago simply ceased to exist. And the boat that killed them was a 78-foot wooden hull running on gasoline engines crewed by 11 sailors armed with a weapon that had no business being on a boat at all. That weapon had been ripped from the nose of a crashed fighter plane 2 days earlier. The man who put it there was a 26-year-old lieutenant named Robert Lynch. He was not an engineer. He was not a weapons designer. He was a patrol boat commander who had watched 6 boats burn in the waters off Guadalcanal and decided he had seen enough. This is the story of how a desperate idea salvaged from a junkyard changed naval warfare forever. How a handful of mechanics, one aircraft armorer and a machinist with a grease pencil, created a weapon that would go on to destroy over 800 Japanese vessels. And how the United States Navy, an institution that rejected field modifications by instinct, looked at the combat results and said yes. But in October 1942, none of that had happened yet. In October 1942, the situation at Guadalcanal was a catastrophe. The Marines had taken Henderson Field on August 7th. They bled for it yard by yard through jungle heat that turned men into shadows of themselves. By October, the field was operational. It was also a target. Japanese bombers hit Henderson almost daily. Betty bombers came in at altitude. Zeros came in low. The Americans scrambled everything they could fly. P-400 Airacobras, F-4F, Wildcats, anything with a propeller and a gun. Aircraft crashed on landing. Aircraft burned on the runway apron. Aircraft sat wrecked in the coral with their engines seized and their wings sheared off, stripped of radios, instruments, and control cables by mechanics who needed the parts for planes that could still fly. Nobody touched the cannons. 3 miles offshore, out on the dark water they called Iron Bottom Sound because of how many ships had gone down in it. Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron 3 was losing the war. One barge at a time. The Japanese had solved a problem. American aircraft had made destroyer runs down the slot too dangerous. Fast destroyers could move at night, but they were visible, they were loud, and they attracted attention. So the Japanese switched to Datsu barges. 49 feet long, 14-foot beam, single diesel engine. Maximum speed 12 knots. Steel plate armor thick enough to stop rifle rounds. Each barge could carry 60 fully armed troops or 8 tons of supplies. Small enough to hug the coastline, low enough in the water to disappear against the jungle tree line, slow enough to be invisible on radar until a PT boat was almost on top of them. The Americans called the nightly supply runs the Tokyo Express. Every night, 20 to 30 barges moved reinforcements and ammunition to Japanese forces on Guadalcanal. Every night, PT boats went out to stop them. Every night, the same thing happened. PT boats detected the barges. PT boats closed to torpedo range. The torpedoes fired. The torpedoes passed directly underneath. The barges drew 5 feet of water. The Mark 8 torpedo had a minimum depth setting of 10 feet. The weapons that PT boats had been built around the weapons that gave torpedo boats their entire reason for existing were physically incapable of hitting their primary targets. The barges then opened fire with Type 92 heavy machine guns. The 7.7mm rounds stitched across wooden decks and through plywood hulls. The PT boats returned fire with twin, 50 caliber Brownings that could put out 850 rounds per minute. The .50 caliber rounds sparked off the steel plate armor and accomplished nothing. The PT boats withdrew or burned. The barges continued to Guadalcanal. The Marines woke up the next morning facing Japanese troops who had arrived on those barges. By mid-October, Squadron 3 had lost 6 boats. 17 sailors were dead. The pattern was simple, and it was killing them. Some crews had tried mounting single-shot Army M337mm anti-tank guns on their bows. They removed the wheels. They lashed the guns to timber planks. One shot, then manual reload, while Japanese machine guns raked the boat. Lieutenant John Kennedy, commanding PT-109, mounted an M3 anti-tank gun the night before a patrol in August. The gun worked in the sense that it fired once before the crew had to reload manually under fire. Not sustainable. Against 20 barges running supplies every single night, one shot was not a solution. It was a gesture. Commander Alan Calvert, the officer commanding Squadron 3 at Tulagi, was a man who understood mathematics. His boats needed to sink multiple barges per patrol to disrupt the supply lines. Single-shot weapons could not do that. Automatic fire could. The problem was finding a weapon that could put automatic fire through steel plate armor from the deck of a 78-foot wooden boat. Robert Lynch found the answer lying in the coral at Henderson Field. Lynch had grown up in Philadelphia. He had been an electrical engineering student before the war, which meant he understood mechanical systems in the way that people who have taken things apart and put them back together understand them not theoretically, but practically. He had been commanding PT-48 since the summer, 26 years old, 14 night patrols, 0 confirmed kills. He had watched the torpedoes miss. He had watched the .50 caliber rounds spark off the armor plate. He had watched the barges pass. On the morning of October 20th, he walked Henderson Field at dawn. 23 wrecked Airacobras sat in various states of destruction around the runway apron. Some had been there for weeks. Mechanics had already stripped them of everything useful, but the cannons were intact. Every single one. Nobody had touched them because they were aircraft weapons. There were no mounting points on PT boats. There was no doctrine for installation. There was no official approval process that had been started. No requisition form that existed. No technical manual that covered the procedure. Lynch stood next to a P-39 with its nose buried in coral. The 37mm Oldsmobile M4 cannon protruded from the propeller hub like a steel fist. He knew what the weapon was. The Airacobra was an unusual aircraft because its engine sat behind the pilot with the propeller shaft running under the cockpit. This bizarre arrangement had been designed specifically to create space in the nose for heavy armament. The M4 cannon fired through the propeller hub at 150 rounds per minute from a 30-round horseshoe magazine. Muzzle velocity of 2,000 feet per second. High explosive rounds. Armor-piercing rounds. Designed to destroy light armor and aircraft structures. The weapon had been built to punch through aluminum and magnesium at altitude. Steel plate on a Datsu barge was lighter than aircraft armor. Lynch did the math. 150 rounds per minute. Automatic fire. Explosive rounds that penetrated and then detonated inside the target. He looked back toward the water. 3 mechanics from his crew were watching him. They knew what he was thinking. By 1400 hours, Lynch was in front of Commander Calvert. There were no forms for what he was proposing. There was no procurement system, no official channel, no safety review board. There was a desperate need and an available solution, and a commander willing to listen to the man standing in front of him. By 1634, PT boat crews were walking Henderson Field with cutting torches and wrenches. They had until nightfall. Technical Sergeant James Coogan had spent 3 years before the war maintaining P-39 aircraft at Selfridge Field in Michigan. He knew every bolt and hydraulic line in an Airacobra cannon assembly the way a surgeon knows anatomy. When Lynch's crew found him on Henderson Field that afternoon, he became the most valuable man on the island. The first P-39 they approached had taken a 20mm cannon round through the cockpit 3 weeks earlier. The pilot had died on impact. Nobody had moved the wreck. Coogan crawled into the nose section with a wrench set and a cutting torch. The M4 cannon was mounted to the aircraft's engine reduction gear housing with 8 high-tensile steel bolts. Each bolt required a 15/16-inch socket. Coogan had a 3/4-inch socket, close enough in wartime. Removing the cannon meant disconnecting hydraulic recoil lines, the charging cable, the ammunition feed chute, and the firing solenoid wiring. Then cutting through the engine mount. 2 hours per aircraft. Nothing went perfectly. The second P-39 had been sitting in tropical heat for 11 days. Hydraulic fluid had congealed. The charging cable had corroded. The mounting bolts had seized from heat expansion. They had no penetrating oil. They used aviation gasoline and waited 20 minutes. The bolts came loose barely. By 1730, they had 3 complete M4 cannon assemblies lying on the coral. Coogan inspected each one. The first showed a hairline crack in the hydraulic recoil cylinder, unusable. The second had a bent pawl in the feed mechanism, repairable with a file and 30 minutes of work. The third was pristine. Chief Machinist's mate Donald Frey designed the pedestal mount in 40 minutes using a grease pencil on a sheet of aluminum. Steel base plate 12 inches in diameter. 4 bolt holes matching PT-48's deck framing. A vertical pipe section welded to the base. A rotating collar with machined bearing surfaces. A yoke to hold the cannon. All constructed from scrap steel salvaged from destroyed aircraft landing gear. His team started welding at 18:15 hours. The generator powering the arc welder kept cutting out because Henderson Field was rationing diesel fuel. They welded in 5-minute intervals. Let the generator cool. Welded again. By 2100 they had a mount. The welds were ugly. The rotating collar had 3 degrees of wobble, but it would hold a 280-pound cannon, and it would rotate. They loaded the cannon and mount onto a truck. 3 sailors rowed in the back, holding it to prevent it from bouncing. A Higgins boat ferried the equipment across Iron Bottom Sound to PT-48 at Tulagi. Lynch was waiting at the dock. Installing the base plate required drilling 4 holes through 3/4-inch plywood and 2 inches of oak framing with a hand crank drill. 30 minutes per hole, 2 hours total. By 1:15 on October 21st, the cannon was mounted on PT-48's bow. It elevated and depressed. It rotated. Not smoothly, but it moved. They stacked 6 loaded 30-round magazines on the deck beside the mount. A loader would hand-feed magazines while the gunner fired. The gun had not been test-fired. The mount had not been stress-tested. The crew had no training on the weapon. None of that mattered. Japanese barges were running supplies that night. PT-48 departed Tulagi at 2200 hours. Gunner's mate second class. Harold Mitchell sat behind the cannon on an ammunition box with 6 magazines within reach. He had fired .50 caliber Brownings on 12 combat patrols. He had never touched an aircraft automatic cannon. Neither had anyone else on the boat. At 23:55, the radar operator called surface contacts, 4 of them, bearing 320 degrees. Speed approximately 8 knots. Datsu barges running down the slot. Lynch altered course to intercept. At 1,000 yards, the lead Japanese barge detected PT-48. The Type 92 machine gun opened fire. Tracer rounds drew orange lines across the black water, 30 yards short. Lynch held course. Mitchell charged the cannon using the manual charging handle. The mechanism worked. He flipped the safety. At 800 yards, Mitchell pressed the trigger. The muzzle flash turned the entire bow deck white. The deck flexed under the recoil. The pedestal mount held. The cannon cycled. 150 rounds per minute, 2.5 rounds per second. Mitchell emptied the first magazine in 12 seconds. The high-explosive rounds hit the lead barge along its waterline. The first 3 punched through the steel plate armor. The fourth detonated inside the troop compartment. The barge's fuel tank ignited. Orange flame erupted from its center. Men jumped into the water. The second barge turned hard to port. PT-48 followed. Lynch closed to 600 yards. Mitchell slammed the second magazine onto the feed mechanism and fired again. 30 rounds in 12 seconds. 22 hit. The 6th round penetrated the armor. The 7th found something volatile. The barge exploded. The blast was visible for 3 miles. That fireball above Iron Bottom Sound at 23:55 on October 21, 1942, was the first proof that a salvaged aircraft cannon bolted to a wooden boat by 9 men in 9 hours could change the course of a naval campaign. By 0300 hours, every PT boat commander in Squadron 3 was demanding one. But Henderson Field only had 23 wrecked Airacobras. Squadron 3 had 12 operational PT boats. The mathematics did not work. And somewhere in Washington, a Bureau of Ordnance that had never heard of this modification was about to receive a dispatch that would force a decision. The question was whether they would say yes before more sailors died, waiting for an answer. 2 nights. 2 barges destroyed, 1 disabled, 0 American casualties. That was the scorecard when PT-48 returned to Tulagi on the morning of October 22, 1942. Lieutenant Robert Lynch had taken a salvaged aircraft cannon, bolted it to a wooden boat in 9 hours, and proved that the weapon worked. Every PT boat commander in Squadron 3 wanted one immediately. The problem was, Henderson Field had 23 wrecked Airacobras, and the mathematics of stripping cannons from crashed fighters had a hard ceiling. But there was a second problem, one that Lynch had not fully considered when he was cutting torches and welding mounts in the dark. The United States Navy had rules about what weapons went on what boats. And someone in Washington was about to remind him of that fact. Commander Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron South Pacific received the after-action report on October 23rd. The report detailed the field modification in precise language. Salvaged M4 cannon from wrecked P-39 aircraft. Improvised pedestal mount fabricated from scrap steel. Installation without Bureau of Ordnance approval. Combat deployment without safety testing. 2 Japanese barges destroyed. The report was factually accurate and institutionally terrifying. By the time it reached Captain John Harley at the MTB command level, 3 additional PT boats had already received cannon installations. The modification was spreading faster than the paperwork that was supposed to stop it. Harley sent a direct communication to Squadron 3 on October 25th. The language was formal and precise and unmistakable. Unauthorized weapons modifications violated naval regulations. Non-standard installations created liability for the commanding officer who authorized them. If a mount failed in combat and killed crew members, Commander Calvert would face a court-martial. If the additional deck weight compromised hull integrity, Calvert would answer for destruction of Navy property. The communication did not order the cannons removed. It did not need to. The implication was clear enough. Calvert read the communication twice. Then he wrote his response. He included the full combat statistics from PT-48's first patrol and the 3 subsequent patrols conducted by boats with newly installed cannons. 8 patrols total. 23 Japanese barges engaged. 14 destroyed. 6 damaged. 3 escaped. 0 PT boats lost in those actions. He attached the numbers without commentary. The numbers spoke for themselves. The response from Harley arrived 2 days later. Results noted. Modification remains unauthorized. Await official guidance before further installations. Lynch was standing on the dock at Tulagi when Calvert read him that line. The 2 men were quiet for a moment. Out in the Sound, Japanese barges were moving supplies. They had been moving supplies every night for weeks. They would move supplies again tonight. "How many boats do we have without cannons?" Lynch asked. 8, Calvert said. "How many barges do we estimate are running tonight?" 20, maybe 25. Neither man said anything else. That evening, Chief Machinist's mate Donald Frey began fabricating mounts for 2 more boats. The bureaucratic situation might have stalled permanently if not for Commander Henry Farrow, who arrived at Tulagi on October 28th as part of an inspection team from South Pacific Command. Farrow was 51 years old, a destroyer man by training who had spent the last year in logistics and procurement. He was not supposed to be the person who saved the cannon program. He was supposed to be the person who filed a compliance report. Instead, Farrow spent 6 hours at the PT boat docks. He talked to Lynch. He talked to Mitchell. He watched Coogan field strip an M4 cannon on a workbench and reassemble it in 20 minutes. He reviewed the after-action reports from every patrol that had used the weapon. Then he asked for a live demonstration. PT-46 took him out into the Sound the next morning. They set up a derelict barge they had captured and anchored it 600 yards offshore. The gunner fired one magazine, 30 rounds in 12 seconds. The barge took 22 hits. It did not sink immediately, but it was structurally destroyed. Its armor plate punched through in 9 places, its hull open to the water, its deck cargo reduced to fragments. Farrow watched the barge settle and said nothing for almost a full minute. "How long did it take to install the first one?" he asked. 9 hours, Lynch said. "We can do it in 4 now." Farrow returned to his quarters that evening and wrote a dispatch to Bureau of Ordnance in Washington. He was not supposed to do this. His mandate was inspection, not advocacy. He wrote it anyway. The dispatch described the field modification in technical detail, attached all available combat data, and made a single direct request. Authorize the installation. Manufacture standardized mounts. Send them to the Pacific. He included one additional line that carried more weight than everything else in the document. Boats without this weapon are being destroyed. Boats with it are surviving. The modification works. Bureau of Ordnance received the dispatch on November 4th. The bureaucratic process that followed would normally take months. Design review, safety analysis, procurement planning, production scheduling, contractor selection. The standard timeline from field request to authorized production ran 6 to 9 months in peacetime, and not much faster in war. Lynch and Calvert knew this. They kept installing cannons. By November, first 8 PT boats in Squadron 3 operated with salvaged 37mm cannons. Henderson Field had been stripped of every usable M4 from wrecked P-39 aircraft. 21 cannons total had been removed. 17 were in service. 4 were held as maintenance spares. The supply of salvaged weapons had reached its absolute limit. The program needed official production or it would die. The answer came from Washington faster than anyone expected. On November 18th, Commander Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron South Pacific sent a formal dispatch to Bureau of Ordnance detailing the modification, the combat results, the pedestal mount design, ammunition, consumption rates, and maintenance requirements. The document was classified confidential. It was complete, precise, and impossible to dismiss. Bureau of Ordnance received it on November 23rd. The response came back on December 7th, exactly 1 year after Pearl Harbor. Authorization granted. Production of standardized pedestal mounts approved. Initial run of 100 units. Delivery in 90 days. In. Contractor selected in Rhode Island. 90 days meant March 1943. PT boats in the Solomons needed the cannons in November 1942. They were already past that deadline, but the authorization meant something that went beyond immediate supply. It meant the modification was real. It meant Calvert had not been wrong to authorize it. It meant Lynch and Frey and Coogan had built something that the United States Navy was now willing to put its name on. Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron 6 arrived at Tulagi in mid-December, with 12 boats and fresh crews who had deployed from the East Coast expecting to fight with torpedoes. They found Squadron 3 destroying barges with salvaged aircraft cannons and immediately wanted the same capability. Squadron 6's commanding officer requested cannon installations for all 12 boats. The problem remained unchanged. Henderson Field had no more wrecked Era Cobras. Every flyable P-39 was in service with the 13th Air Force. The program was at a standstill. The solution arrived from New Caledonia, where a cargo ship had delivered 12 complete M4 cannon assemblies packed in Cosmoline preservative as replacement parts for damaged P-39 fighters. The cannons were intended for aircraft repair at Henderson Field. They never arrived at Henderson Field. A Catalina flying boat transported them directly to Tulagi. The requisition paperwork described them as P-39 maintenance components. Technically accurate. Operationally, they became naval weapons within 48 hours of landing. By December 20th, Squadron 6 was installing new cannons on their boats using the improved pedestal mount design that Frey had refined after examining PT-48's worn bearing surfaces from combat use. Bronze bushings, salvaged from damaged aircraft wheel assemblies, reduced friction in the rotating collar. The second-generation mounts rotated smoothly under combat loading. The new cannons were pristine hydraulic systems, intact feed mechanisms, perfect barrels unfired. The difference from salvaged Henderson Field weapons was immediate and measurable. The joint patrols began in January 1943. 24 PT boats operating in the Solomons with 37mm cannons. Squadron 3, Squadron 6, and 4 boats from Squadron 2. The barge-busting capability was no longer a field expedient practiced by one desperate unit. It was a coordinated tactical system. Japanese supply operations, which had run with relative impunity for months, suddenly faced systematic destruction from multiple directions simultaneously. January combat reports documented 37 PT boat patrols engaging Japanese barges. 41 barges destroyed, 19 damaged, 8 escaped. The weapon that Lynch had salvaged from a crashed fighter in October had multiplied across the entire PT boat force in the South Pacific in 3 months. Japanese commanders noticed. Radio intercepts from late January described PT boats with heavy automatic cannon firing explosive shells. The messages used the phrase, "demon boats." Barge crews that had operated with confidence along the coastline began refusing night missions or demanding destroyer escorts. The psychological impact was real and measurable. Japanese barge traffic dropped 40% in the waters around Guadalcanal between December and February. But something else was happening simultaneously, something that Lynch and Calvert and Farrow could not have anticipated when they were focused on solving the barge problem. Japanese naval intelligence had begun collecting wreckage and reports on the PT boat modifications. They were studying the weapon, they were studying the tactics. And in early February 1943, Japanese destroyer commanders received new orders for their barge escort operations. The destroyers would no longer wait offshore while barges ran independently. They would accompany the convoys. They would engage PT boats at long range with 5-inch guns before the PT boats could close to cannon range. The 37mm M4 was devastating against a Datsu barge with 1/4-inch steel plate. Against a destroyer with 3 inches of hardened armor on its hull, it accomplished nothing. The weapon that had changed everything was suddenly insufficient. Lynch had solved one problem and created another. The PT boats needed heavier weapons that could engage destroyers. Weapons that did not yet exist in the Pacific, in the quantities or configurations required. And somewhere, in a Bureau of Ordnance office in Washington, engineers were already working on a solution that would take the M4 cannon and make it something entirely different. The question was whether it would arrive before the Japanese escorts turned the tables completely. By January 1943, the salvaged aircraft cannon that Robert Lynch bolted to PT-48's bow in 9 desperate hours had spread to 24 boats across 3 squadrons. 14 barges destroyed in the first 8 patrols had become 41 barges destroyed in January alone. Bureau of Ordnance had authorized production. The modification was real official and multiplying, but at the end of Part 2, Japanese destroyer commanders had received new orders. Escort the barges. Engage PT boats at long range before they can close. The weapon that solved one problem had triggered a response that created a deadlier one. And now in the waters off Guadalcanal, the Japanese were adapting faster than anyone in Washington had anticipated. In February 1943, Japanese naval intelligence completed its assessment of the PT boat cannon modifications. The report reached Vice Admiral Junichi Kusaka at Rabaul on February 8th. The document was precise. PT boats operating in the Solomons had mounted 37mm automatic cannons salvaged from American P-39 aircraft. The weapons fired explosive rounds at 150 rounds per minute. Effective range against Datsu barges was 600 yards. The cannons had destroyed 63 Japanese supply barges since October. Barge traffic to Guadalcanal had dropped 40% in 60 days. Kusaka convened an emergency staff conference. The officers around the table understood what the numbers meant. Guadalcanal's garrison was receiving less than 30% of planned supplies. Ammunition was critically short. Food was critically short. Men were dying not from American bullets, but from starvation and disease because PT boats were destroying the supply line. The cannons had to be neutralized. The Japanese response came in three forms. First, destroyer escorts for all major barge convoys. 5-inch naval guns could engage PT boats at 2,000 yards well outside the effective range of the 37mm cannon. Second, armored barges with reinforced steel plate on the bow and sides thick enough to resist 37mm rounds at ranges above 400 yards. Third, coordinated night operations with float planes providing aerial observation spotting PT boats before they could close to attack range. The tactics worked immediately. February 12th, PT-47 attempted to engage a barge convoy off Kolombangara. A Japanese destroyer detected the boat at 1,800 yards and opened fire with 5-inch guns. PT-47 broke off the attack. The barge convoy reached its destination intact. February 14th. The same pattern. February 17th, PT-60 took a near miss from destroyer gunfire that opened a seam in its hull and sent 3 sailors to the medical bay. The PT boats were winning against barges and losing against destroyers. The 37mm cannon had raised the stakes of the entire campaign, and now the Japanese were raising them again. But this was not the only problem Lynch and his crews were facing. The M4 cannon was designed for aircraft service. Brief bursts, controlled altitude, ground crew maintenance between every mission. PT boats operated continuously in saltwater tropical heat and coral dust. By February, the maintenance crisis that Coogan had warned about was becoming critical. Saltwater corroded hydraulic recoil systems. Rubber seals degraded in the heat. Feed mechanisms jammed from sand and grit in ways that never happened at altitude. PT-46 suffered a catastrophic feed mechanism failure on February 19th during a barge engagement. The cannon jammed after firing 11 rounds. The gunner cleared the jam manually, while Japanese machine gun fire hit the boat's bow. 1 round struck the ammunition box beside the cannon mount. The box did not detonate, but it was close enough that the crew understood exactly how close they had come. When PT-46 returned to Tulagi, the after-action report documented the malfunction in full detail. 2 more cannon failures followed in the next week. PT-40 experienced a hydraulic recoil failure that allowed the cannon to slam backward on its mount, splitting the yoke weld. PT-109 suffered a complete feed mechanism seizure during a patrol, reducing the boat to .50 caliber fire for the remainder of the night. The failure rate across the fleet had climbed to 1 malfunction per 4 combat patrols. Before the modifications, PT boats had no barge-killing capability at all. Now, they had unreliable barge-killing capability, which in some ways was more dangerous because crews depended on weapons that might not work when they needed them most. A staff officer at MTB headquarters wrote in a February report that the field modification, while tactically effective, represented a maintenance burden that forward-deployed units could not sustain without dedicated technical support. The report recommended pausing further cannon installations until factory-manufactured weapons with proper naval specifications could replace the salvaged aircraft guns. Lynch read that report and disagreed with every sentence. The cannons were working. The maintenance problems were real but solvable. Pulling them would mean returning to the situation of October 1942, where PT boats had no answer to armored barges. He said as much to Calvert. Calvert forwarded his objection to headquarters with a single added line. Results in combat outweigh maintenance difficulties. Recommend continued operation with increased technical support. Coogan expanded his workshop. He trained 12 additional gunners' mates. He developed a field maintenance checklist that addressed the specific failure modes appearing in combat. saltwater flush of hydraulic systems after every patrol, manual inspection of feed pals before every mission, bronze seal replacements every 30 days regardless of visible wear. The failure rate dropped from 1 malfunction per 4 patrols to 1 per 11 patrols within 6 weeks. The cannon program survived. Then came the night of March 5, 1943, and everything changed again. Japanese forces were attempting to reinforce Vila on Kolombangara Island. Vila was a secondary base, but its garrison controlled waters that American forces needed to move through for the next phase of the Solomons campaign. Intelligence indicated a major supply convoy, 8 barges, 2 destroyer escorts, moving under cover of darkness from Buin at the southern end of Bougainville. Squadron 3 sent 6 boats. PT-48, PT-46, PT-40, PT-60, PT-109, and PT-117. Lynch commanded the formation from PT-48. The plan was straightforward and dangerous. 2 boats would engage the destroyer escorts with torpedoes drawing their attention and fire. The remaining 4 boats would close on the barges and use the 37mm cannons. Simultaneous attack, coordinated timing, maximum confusion. It was the most ambitious PT boat operation attempted in the Solomons. At 22:15 hours, the formation made radar contact. 10 contacts total. 2 large, 8 small. The destroyers and the barges exactly as intelligence had predicted. Range 4,000 yards closing at 8 knots. Lynch split the formation. PT-109 and PT-117 broke left, angling for torpedo position on the destroyers. The 4 cannon boats turned right, circling wide to approach the barges from the landward side, where the destroyers would have difficulty firing without risk of hitting their own vessels. At 22:47 Pacific Time, 109 launched 2 torpedoes at the lead destroyer, both missed. The destroyer detected the launch, turned hard, and opened fire with its 5-inch guns. PT-109 ran at full speed, zigzagging smoke pouring from its exhaust. The destroyer pursued. PT-117 fired 2 more torpedoes. 1 passed ahead of the second destroyer. 1 detonated at the end of its run. Neither hit. But the destroyers were occupied. Lynch brought PT-48 in from the northwest at 35 knots. The barges were visible at 800 yards, dark shapes against slightly darker water. No moon, no lights. The Type 92 machine guns on the barges opened fire when PT-48 closed to 600 yards. Tracers crossed the water. Mitchell opened fire at 500 yards. The cannon roared. The muzzle flash was white and total. The first magazine emptied in 12 seconds. 11 rounds hit the lead barge. The barge's fuel caught on the 5th hit. It was burning before Mitchell finished the magazine. PT-46 came in from the south. Its cannon opened fire on the second barge simultaneously. PT-40 engaged the third. PT-60 took the fourth. 4 boats, 4 cannons, 4 barges. The barge crews had no experience defending against this. Single PT boat attacks, they understood. Coordinated multi-cannon attacks from different directions simultaneously were something new. The Type 92 machine guns could not cover all quadrants at once. Japanese gunners had to choose targets. Whatever they chose, 1 or 2 PT boats were firing without return fire. The second barge detonated at 22:53. Ammunition cook-off identical to the explosion on October 21st. The fireball lit the entire action from horizon to horizon. For 5 seconds, the water was bright as daylight. The third barge attempted to run for the coastline. PT-40 pursued at 35 knots, close to 300 yards, and fired. The cannon put 24 rounds into the barge at point-blank range. The barge stopped. It did not sink immediately, but it was finished. The 4th barge turned directly toward PT-60, apparently attempting to ram. PT-60's gunner fired the cannon at 200 yards. The rounds entered the barge through its bow and exited through its stern. The barge's engine died. It drifted. The remaining 4 barges scattered. 2 ran northwest. 2 ran south. Lynch pursued the northern pair. He caught the first at 400 yards and fired 2 magazines. The barge burned. He lost the second in the darkness. PT-46 caught one of the southern barges near the coastline and destroyed it. At 1:15 on March 6th, the 6 PT boats reformed and returned to Tulagi. The destroyers had broken off pursuit after 40 minutes, returning to cover the surviving barges. Neither destroyer had been hit. PT-109 had taken 2 machine gun rounds through its bow. No crew casualties in the entire formation. The after-action count was 6 barges destroyed, 1 barge disabled, 1 barge escaped. Of the 8 barges carrying reinforcements to Vila 7 never arrived. The Japanese garrison on Kolombangara received none of the supplies intended for them that night. The men who had been on those barges did not reach Vila. The March 5th action became the single most effective PT boat operation of the entire Solomons campaign, measured by barges destroyed per boat engaged. Lynch filed his after-action report the following morning. Calvert forwarded it to headquarters with a cover note that contained 1 sentence. This is what these weapons can do when crews have training and coordination. Commander Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron South Pacific distributed the report to every PT boat unit in the Pacific within 2 weeks. The tactics from March 5th coordinated multi-boat cannon attacks with torpedo boats drawing destroyer attention became standard doctrine. Squadrons in New Guinea and the Philippines received copies of Lynch's after-action report as part of their pre-deployment training. The statistical impact of the cannon program became undeniable when February and March numbers were compiled. PT boats with 37mm cannons were destroying Japanese barges at a rate 6 times higher than boats relying on torpedoes alone. Crew casualties in barge engagements dropped 60% compared to the pre-cannon period. Japanese barge traffic in the Central Solomons declined by 55% between October 1942 and March 1943. Supply shortages crippled Japanese defensive operations at exactly the moment American forces were preparing the next advance up the island chain. Vice Admiral Kusaka acknowledged the impact in a staff communication recovered after the war. He wrote that American torpedo boat cannon fire had made barge supply operations in the Central Solomons effectively impossible. His forces were unable to reinforce positions because the supply chain had been severed by weapons that, in his assessment, should not have been able to exist on boats of that size. The weapon that should not have been able to exist had been built in a machine shop running on rationed diesel fuel, with a grease pencil sketch as its engineering drawing by men who had never designed a naval weapon in their lives. Lynch received the Navy Cross in November 1942. Mitchell received the Bronze Star for actions in August 1943. Coogan's maintenance logs, which documented every cannon removed from every wrecked P-39 and every modification made under fire, survived the war and now sit in the National Archives. Frey received no official recognition at all. But the story of what these men built and what it cost and what it became has one final chapter that most histories skip entirely. What happened to the weapon after the war ended? What happened to the men? And what does it mean that the most effective naval weapon innovation of the Pacific Campaign began with a lieutenant walking through a graveyard of crashed fighter planes at dawn, doing math in his head? That answer is in Part 4, and it is not the ending anyone expected. From a crashed fighter's nose cone, salvaged in 9 hours, to 24 PT boats, destroying Japanese supply lines across the entire Pacific. From an unauthorized field modification that could have ended Calvert's career, to factory standard equipment rolling off production lines in New Jersey. From one desperate lieutenant walking a graveyard of wrecked Airacobras at dawn to 800 confirmed Japanese vessels destroyed. That was the journey of Parts 1 through 3. But Part 3 ended with a question that the combat statistics cannot answer. What happened to the men when the guns finally went silent? And what does it mean that the most consequential naval weapons Innovation of the Pacific War began with a grease pencil sketch on a sheet of aluminum. The answer involves a twist that almost no one knows. Robert Lynch commanded PT-48 for 15 months of combat operations in the Solomons. 47 patrols, 19 confirmed kills. He received the Navy Cross in November 1942, the citation specifically acknowledging his initiative in mounting salvaged aircraft cannons on PT boats. When the Guadalcanal campaign ended in February 1943, Lynch rotated back to the United States for reassignment. He was 27 years old and had compressed more combat experience into 15 months than most officers accumulated in an entire career. The Navy offered him a training command position in Rhode Island, instructing new PT boat crews on tactics developed in the Solomons. He accepted. He spent the remainder of the war teaching other men to fight with weapons he had helped create. Lynch returned to Philadelphia in 1946 and resumed the electrical engineering studies the war had interrupted. He completed his degree, joined a mid-sized engineering firm, married, had 3 children, and lived quietly in the same city where he had grown up. He never sought recognition for the cannon modification. He gave no interviews to journalists, writing about the PT boat war. When a naval historian contacted him in 1971 for a book on Guadalcanal operations, Lynch replied with a brief letter declining to participate. He said the story belonged to the crew, not to him. He died in 1978 at age 62. The obituary in the Philadelphia Inquirer identified him as a retired electrical engineer and Navy veteran. It mentioned no specific wartime service. Harold Mitchell, the gunner who fired the first 37mm cannon shot from a PT boat, transferred to PT-109 in January 1943 as a gunnery instructor. He taught 23 crews in the Solomons how to operate the salvaged cannons before receiving his Bronze Star for actions at Vella La Vella in August 1943. After the war, Mitchell moved to Seattle and spent 30 years working for Boeing as a machinist. He died in 2006 at age 83. His daughter told an interviewer that he kept a photograph of PT-48 in his workshop until the end of his life, but rarely spoke about what happened on October 21, 1942. He called it just a night on the water. Donald Frey, the man whose 40-minute grease pencil sketch became the basis for 100 factory-manufactured pedestal mounts, received nothing official. No medal, no commendation, no mention in any citation. He remained at Henderson Field until December 1943, then transferred to Pearl Harbor for submarine maintenance duty. He returned after the war to Tacoma. Washington worked at a shipyard for 22 years and died in 1991 at age 73. His family did not know about the cannon mount until a researcher found Coogan's maintenance logs in the National Archives in 2003 and traced the design credit back through the documentation. By then, Frey had been dead for 12 years. James Coogan lived the longest of the 4. He transferred from Henderson Field to Tulagi in November 1942 and spent the rest of the war maintaining PT boat cannons and training gunners' mates. After the war, he remained in the Air Force, rising to Master Sergeant and retiring in 1962. He kept his maintenance logs organized and intact through every reassignment and move. When he donated them to the National Archives in 1978, the same year Lynch died, the documentation they contained was the most complete technical record of the field modification in existence. Coogan died in 1989 at age 71. The logs are in Box 447 of the MTB Squadron Records collection. They are available to researchers by appointment. The technical legacy of what these 4 men built outlasted all of them by decades. The 37mm M9 cannon that entered factory production in August 1943 remained in service on American patrol craft through the Korean War. Boats operating in the confined coastal waters of the Korean Peninsula faced the same tactical problem Lynch had faced in 1942, shallow draft enemy vessels carrying troops and supplies that conventional torpedoes could not effectively engage. The cannon that had been developed for Guadalcanal worked in Korea for the same reasons it had worked in the Solomons. explosive automatic fire against lightly armored small craft. The principle did not age. The broader concept traveled further. Soviet naval architects studying American PT boat operations after the war, through intelligence reports and post-war technical exchanges, incorporated automatic cannon armament as standard equipment on their Kometa and Shershin-class torpedo boats in the 1950s and 1960s. The Soviet weapons were heavier, more sophisticated, and purpose-built for naval use, rather than adapted from aircraft. But the tactical logic was identical to what Lynch had worked out standing next to a crashed P-39 in October 1942. Fast small boats need automatic cannon fire to engage small targets that torpedoes cannot hit. Every modern naval patrol craft in the world, from the Israeli SAR class to the Chinese Type 022 missile boat, carries automatic cannon armament as its primary close-range weapon. The lineage from Henderson Field to every patrol boat dock in the world runs in a direct line through the improvised pedestal mount that Frey built from aircraft landing gear. Colt manufactured 1,547 M9 cannons between August 1943 and August 1945. Of those, 847 were installed on PT boats. The remaining 700 went to landing craft patrol vessels and coastal defense installations. Post-war Navy analysis credited PT boats equipped with 37mm cannons with 800 confirmed vessel kills across the Pacific and Mediterranean theaters between October 1942 and August 1945. The majority were Datsu-class barges. Each barge carried 60 troops, or 8 tons of supplies. The mathematics of what those 800 kills prevented from reaching Japanese defensive positions runs into tens of thousands of troops and hundreds of thousands of tons of ammunition and food. Historians who have studied Japanese logistics in the late Pacific War argue that the destruction of the barge supply network, more than any single land battle, broke the Japanese ability to reinforce and resupply island garrisons during the critical 1943 and 1944 campaigns. The innovation succeeded not because it was sophisticated, but because it was honest. It addressed a specific real problem with specific available materials, tested the solution in combat, documented the results, and let the numbers make the argument. That process sounds simple. In practice, within a military institution, with strong preferences for established doctrine and authorized equipment, it was anything but simple. Calvert took genuine institutional risk when he authorized the first installation. If the mount had failed and killed Mitchell, Calvert would have faced consequences that would have ended his career. He authorized it anyway because his boats were dying and he had a commander willing to try something that might work. That willingness to accept institutional risk for a field modification with documented combat results is rarer than it should be. The Army during the same period rejected dozens of field modifications that tank crews and infantry units developed under combat pressure. Welded additional armor on Sherman tanks, which crews added because the standard armor was killing them, was repeatedly banned as unauthorized modification that voided manufacturer warranties. The Navy's flexibility in the Pacific, its willingness to look at combat results rather than procurement procedures, was not inevitable. It was a choice made by specific officers at specific moments, and it saved lives. The final detail in this story is the one that almost no one knows, and it is the one that makes the entire narrative complete. PT-48 was decommissioned in 1944 after sustaining hull damage that made repairs uneconomical. The boat was stripped of usable equipment and broken up. The M4 cannon that Mitchell fired on October 21, 1942. The original salvaged weapon was removed before decommissioning and transferred to the Tulagi Maintenance Depot. Coogan's logs recorded as serial number M4-7741, removed from PT-48 on March 3, 1944. Condition fair hydraulic recoil system replaced twice barrel showing moderate wear from extended use. After the war, the contents of the Tulagi Depot were inventoried and mostly scrapped or surplused. Serial number M4-7741 disappears from official records after the 1945 inventory. For 58 years, the cannon's location was unknown. In 2003, a collector in New South Wales, Australia, purchased a lot of decommissioned American military equipment from a Pacific Islands estate sale. Among the items was a 37mm aircraft cannon in fair condition, serial number M4-7741. The collector recognized it as an M4 and contacted the National Museum of the Pacific War in Fredericksburg, Texas. The museum cross-referenced the serial number against Coogan's archived maintenance logs. The match was exact. The cannon sitting in a storage shed in New South Wales was the same weapon Harold Mitchell had fired into a Japanese barge at 800 yards on the night of October 21, 1942. The museum acquired it in 2004. It underwent conservation treatment and is now displayed in the PT Boat exhibit alongside documentation of the Henderson Field Modification Program. The maintenance log entry in Coogan's handwriting dated October 21, 1942, noting the cannon's first combat use is displayed beside the weapon. Lynch never knew the cannon survived. Mitchell never knew either. Coogan, who died 15 years before it was found, would have recognized his own handwriting on the tag. From a 26-year-old lieutenant with no weapons design experience, a machinist's mate with a grease pencil, an aircraft armorer with the right socket wrench, and a gunner who had never touched an aircraft cannon, came 800 enemy vessels, destroyed 1,547 production weapons, manufactured 60 years of patrol boat doctrine, and a principle of naval warfare that every modern navy in the world still applies today. They built it in 9 hours from salvaged parts in a machine shop running on rationed diesel fuel. Because the problem was real, the solution was available, and there was no time to wait for official approval. The cannon that should not have existed, built by men who had no authority to build it, changed the war. That is why the story is worth telling. And that is why Donald Frey, who sketched the blueprint that became standard naval equipment and received nothing for it, deserves to have his name said out loud one more time.